Hi there, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about tanks in Mythic Plus Season 1 of Dragonflight. I did a raid tank tier list, well, technically 2 days ago now, but now it's Mythic Plus tier list time. As with any tier list, it's not too serious, it's basically just an excuse to talk about all the tanks and compare them to each other. And of course, before actually diving in, here are a couple of quick reminders. This is just my opinion. I am trying to base it off of data, numerical analysis where I can, but it's my interpretation of that data, of those numbers, so maybe you disagree and that's okay. Because this is the Mythic Plus list and not the raid list, overall damage and mitigation and external healing requirements are a much bigger deal. External healing required per second is the most important metric for evaluating a tank's tankiness. How much healing does it need to live? Prot Warrior has the lowest external healing required of any tank. That stat is like a golf score, the lower the better, so Warrior basically wins. Thanks for watching, bye! It's not the end-all be-all stat, but in Mythic Plus, you don't have a lot of extra healing floating around like you do in Raid. So being able to bring your own healing or mitigate a ton of damage is great. If you're a tank that can't do one of those things, or God forbid both, you're at a bit of a disadvantage. And final point, covering spots in the buff, debuff matrix is less important in Mythic Plus groups because you're in a smaller group. If you're a monk, for example, buffing the physical damage of a 20 or 30 person raid is just a much larger percentage damage increase than it is buffing the physical damage of a 5-person dungeon group. You might be the only person in the group who deals physical damage anyways. The same thing goes for Warrior's Battle Shout. Demon Hunter and Druid both bring buffs that are more universal since way more specs in the game deal magic damage than physical damage. And even a lot of physical damage dealers also deal spell damage like Assassination Rogues, DKs, and Pallies. On the subject of Pallies, bringing 3% damage reduction to the group, also very useful. A lot more so than in Raid, where you're probably getting it from a Holy Pally so that they can use Aura Mastery as a Raid cooldown, blah blah blah. This also means that classes who bring a battle res, like DK, Druid, and Paladin, all have a huge utility advantage just as a baseline. Okay, let's now go class by class, and we'll start with Blood DK. Blood DKs were born to do Mythic Plus. They have everything you could want in a tank to be self-sufficient. They have tons of self-healing, tons of cooldowns, 2 new crowd control skills, or well, 1 new one, but 2 total. Blinding Sleet is a frontal AoE cone that does a disorient, and Asphyxiate is their classic single target stun. They also have Battle Res. Their AoE damage is decent, it's not crazy, it's definitely not bursty, but it is respectable. DK has so much self-healing, which is really powerful in Mythic Plus. Their only real weakness defensively is just that they take a lot more damage than other tanks, and while their healing mostly makes up for that, things can get a little sketchy at times. The class is a lot less forgiving than some of the other defense-first tanks, like Prot Warrior. Having Death Grips, having Mass Grip, having Gorfine's Grasp is the main piece of group utility that DK provides. AoE grips are amazingly good in Mythic Plus, being able to pull 2 packs of casters or archers or annoying mobs that leap out of the pack back in so that your team can cleave them down is great. Being able to pull spiteful ads away from your party is great. I think Blood DK is a B tier tank, and the reason for that, I realize that is a little controversial. The reason for that is not their defenses. Their defenses against the training dummy are S tier. I feel like they are in a separate class of tanks from the ones above them in Mythic Plus due to how unforgiving they are. You have a tank that has extremely powerful self-sustain, S tier, some of the best defenses around. It just is... It has issues with being too complex. You have to maintain Death and Decay while tanking, so it's a bit like Paladin in that movement is punishing, except that unlike Pally, who loses a little bit of defensive value and then just sets down another Consecration, DK loses out offensive value, their Heart Strike doesn't hit as many targets, you lose runic power generation because you're only getting 2 targets worth of RP from your Heart Strikes, then you're losing damage, you're losing healing. This all reduces your self-healing further down the line and causes long-term cumulative effects that ripple out over the next 15 to 20 seconds after you've made a mistake, rather than just occurring immediately. Blood DK wants to stand still and tank is what it boils down to. That can be hit and miss in Mythic Plus. DK is dangerous to tank on when you're forced to move around. My biggest annoyance with DK is that the damage profile is so flat. There's just no burst at all. This makes picking up threat on pulls a lot tougher on a DK than it is on every other tank. Monk and DK, I think, are the 2 hardest tanks to play, and if I had to really nail down the difference between the 2, the difficult part of DK is playing the rotation. The difficult part of Monk is figuring out how to bind all of this skills. DK is a lot of fun. I don't want to sell it short here. It's super rewarding to play well, but it is more difficult than most of the other tanks on this list. I think that if you're like a really highly skilled elite player, that DK probably is an S tier tank for you. But for most people, I think the fact that it is so punishing on your mistakes and pretty hard to do just some of the basics of tanking, like picking up threat, I think that puts it a little bit below some of the other tanks. Vengeance Demon Hunter is next, and I feel like I have to say it. Vengeance Demon Hunter is the total package. You're not Vengeance. There we go. Vengeance Demon Hunter has everything. It does good AoE damage, it has good self-healing, it has really good offensive cooldowns, but it also has good sustained damage and sustained defenses. It has everything you could want out of a tank in Mythic Plus. It has multiple forms of AoE CC in the class talent tree. You could pick up the AoE Stun or Sigil of Misery, both are fine. If you fully talent it out, you can get Sigil of Silence to silence in AoE for 10 seconds. 10 entire American seconds. That's crazy. How long is the cooldown on that amazing 10-second AoE silence? It's got to be like a couple of minutes, right? 48 seconds. You can keep casters silenced for literally over 20% of the time you're tanking them, which is preposterous. Demon Hunter's defensive cooldowns aren't up very often, which is probably the biggest issue with them as a class, but I think that having Frailty is worth that one limitation. Frailty basically is a mid-level defensive cooldown that you maintain 100% of the time. You aren't able to stack it up quite as much as you are in Mythic Plus, or rather as much in Mythic Plus as you are in Raid, due to Spirit Bomb being a skill that you just use a little less often than Soul Cleave, but either way, you're still able to maintain about 12 to 16% damage reduction on the enemies you're tanking on average, going up above 20% at times, and you have a bunch of other defensive layers to put on over the top of that. Utility-wise, you have crowd control, obviously the AoE silences, and your magic damage debuff. You can take darkness, it's not great, the cooldown is long, the positioning requirement is pretty severe, and it's not even super reliable. Like, I think I would put it behind anti-magic zone for blood DKs as far as like group defensive cooldowns go in Mythic Plus, but it is technically better than nothing, so that's something. In terms of ranking DH, I think it is like an A+ tank. Not only are they super duper strong all the time, they're really easy to play all the time too. Holding threat on a Demon Hunter is a dream. You don't need cooldowns to just throw down a Sigil of Flames, leap in and hit Immolation Aura and Spirit Bomb. That's all you gotta do and you got threat. You will take more physical damage as a Demon Hunter than like a warrior does, but everyone does really. You mitigate more magic damage on a Demon Hunter than anyone, and you still have a lot of physical damage mitigation as well, so you're in great shape both offensively and defensively. There is nothing wrong with Demon Hunter at all, but there's also nothing insanely broken about Demon Hunter either. Everything that's there is just very, very good and well balanced. I also said this in the other video, but I think that it's worth repeating. Demon Hunter might be the most fun tank, and that counts for a lot for me. It was my favorite tank in Mythic Plus for most of Shadowlands, and I think it's only gotten more fun in Dragonflight. I realize that fun is subjective, and that's fine, but it constantly does tons of AoE damage, it dominates all the caster mobs that it can find, and it has great defensive tools. I mean, what's not fun about that? Bear Druid is up next, and they're so weird now, but in a really powerful way. They deal lots of AoE damage during Incarnation, but they also deal lots of AoE damage outside Incarnation as well. This is a huge change from Shadowlands, where you could barely even hold threat when your cooldowns weren't up unless you had a rogue or a hunter giving you tricks or misdirection. You basically just mangle Thrash and then swipe your way to a rainstorm of passive Moonfire spam, which is great for damage, great for self-healing thanks to Elun's Favored healing you for 30% of all the Moonfire damage you deal, and great for rage generation thanks to the amazing interaction between Galactic Guardian and Twin Moonfire, granting you double rage from all of your Galactic Guardian procs. Bear Druid, arguably more than any other tank, scales very, very well with increased target count. You get more rage from Blood Frenzy, more rage from those Moonfire talents, and if you make big enough pulls, you can literally have more rage generation than you're able to spend. I realize that Death Knight and Warrior get more runic power and more rage from adding in more targets, but they don't scale up nearly as well as Druid does with extra targets. I guess the same goes for like Demon Hunters and Spawning Souls with Immolation Aura, but that's pretty limited. Pally getting shielding from Avenger Shields, but again, the same thing applies here. Druid outscales them all. Historically, having more rage wouldn't really matter that much. Having more Iron First stacks is good, but armor scaling has pretty severe diminishing returns, and you know, let's say that you get a few seconds during Incarnation where you manage to get up to the 85% armor cap. Great. That doesn't really do anything for you in the long-term span of tanking a Mythic Plus run. The difference now is that Druid gets cooldown reduction on Incarnation for all the rage they spend, and group healing from After the Wildfire for all the rage they spend. So you have this massive pair of incentives to generate and spend as much rage as you possibly can all the time. Bear Druids are arguably the simplest tank around if you go with the normal approach of spamming swipe in between your main rage generators of Mangle and Thrash. If you try to maintain Moonfire on every target in a pull, you know, like a 5-target pull, then that's like good for maximizing your damage output and your rage generation and your defensive value, but it can become a good bit more complex than just Thrash, Mangle, Swipe. That's a lot of extra effort for not that huge of a gain, though, really. On a completely unrelated subject of group utility, Bear Druid has some. They have Battle Res, they have a couple of good crowd control skill choice nodes, like, you know, Typhoon isn't actually a choice node, but that's an option. Mass Entanglement or Ursoc's circle grip thing. Incapacitating Roar, single target stun. You know, they have some okay group utility, group CC. They also can take Nature's Vigil for even more group healing, which is nice, and you provide Mark of the Wild, giving your group 3% versatility, which is great. So just like with the raid tier list, I think Bear Druid's probably the best tank in the game. I think it's extremely competitive with Prot Warrior and Mythic Plus right now. It is definitely an S tier tank either way. It doesn't have the same level of damage mitigation as Warrior does, but Bear's damage mitigation from armor is extremely high now thanks to how much rage you're able to generate. And that's quite a change of pace from earlier in the beta, even like 3 weeks ago. The days of barely being able to keep up 1 or 2 Iron First stacks at a time are just a thing of the past. At 3 stacks, you have more armor than any other tank in the game by quite a good bit, and maintaining 1 stack of Iron Fur only takes about 5.7 rage per second. 17 rage a second is what you would need to maintain 3. My AoE rage generation against sustained 5-target cleave is 22 per second without any cooldowns in normal raid item level, not including the tier set bonus. That's enough to constantly maintain about 4 stacks. My number that I've been throwing around of about 20 rage a second is a pretty conservative estimate based on like early pre-raid gear that's not super optimized, no tier set bonus of course, you know, and all that. Bear Druid's absolute floor is that it is like tankier than a brick wall, and it just gets better the more that you gear it. It also has pretty short defensive cooldowns on Bark Skin and Survival Instincts, on top of Rage of the Sleeper and Incarn both being short cooldowns themselves. So again, huge changes from Shadowlands. Bears just have really good cooldown availability. And finally, players have been expecting After the Wildfire to get nerfed, and Blizzard unveiled their nerf last night, and it's capped at 5 targets. This does almost nothing in Mythic Plus. It can hit pets, so there's probably going to be some back and forth with players begging to make that stop so that it has some sort of smart targeting to ensure pets aren't eating healing that should have gone to players. But otherwise, it's basically as insane as it was before. Bear Druids can be out here passively doing like 30,000 HPS to the group. Just a second healer in dungeon groups, while also doing tons of damage and being turbo tanks. Best tank in the game. Brewmaster Monks are up next. And before I even start in on them, I have to talk about some hidden buffs that were made overnight, like literally minutes after I finished last night's last minute tank changes video, because Blizzard had even more changes that were even last minute-ier. Undocumented Brewmaster buffs with weekly reset self-healing buff. This is great, right? It's healing buffs. Gift of the Ox has received a 60% healing increase, which is completely unexpected. It doesn't fix absolutely everything wrong with Monk's self-healing, but it goes a pretty long way toward making Monks a more normal tank in Mythic Plus, from a self-healing perspective anyways. Celestial Brew also received a 40% buff, which again just helps a lot with mitigating like spell damage or burst damage from bosses and lieutenant mobs, basically anything that you couldn't dodge. It just helps with staying alive in general, really. These changes are both great, and they address one of the core problems with the class. Then there was the change to Pretense of Instability, which helps address the other core problem with the class defensively, damage reduction. Previously, Pretense of Instability was a 10% dodge buff that only had about 25% uptime in a normal talent setup, so like 2.5% total dodge. That's not great. It was good way back when it was a Legion artifact trait and the class was designed very differently so that it had 100% uptime, but now it doesn't have anywhere close to that, and it was pretty bad. Today's buff has increased the duration of the buff and the dodge chance it provides, and now it's worth about 5% dodge chance with that same standard talent setup. But if you play a blackout combo setup and empower all of your Keg Smash casts, which is pretty easy, I'll show a talent calculator here just to sort of, show off what you would be playing. Still sticking with Shadowboxing Treads. In Mythic Plus, you're going to want those 2 extra targets hit by your blackout kicks. It is worth that. Really getting the cooldown reduction talent on blackout kick, fluidity of motion, doesn't really do anything for you in Mythic Plus because your goal with blackout combo is to use it on Keg Smash, and Keg Smash is going to have a longer cooldown than the blackout kick either way. You also get extra mastery stacks out of hitting multiple targets with your blackout kicks with Shadowboxing Treads, so just better all around to go with this. But you're taking Pretense of Instability, you're taking blackout combo, there you go. If you're running that setup, you can get your average Purifying Brew cooldown to around 10 seconds. This means you would be sitting at about 50% uptime on this 15% dodge buff. That's an average of 7.5% dodge chance, which is, 3 times as good as it was before, but also it creates 2 sort of defensive windows as well. You have one window where you've just purified and you're taking basically 15% less damage from auto attacks for the next 5 seconds. Then you have this other window where you're taking more damage for 5 seconds, but you're going to purify at the end of it. So you're sort of generating, building up some damage intake and then purifying it away. Almost like it fits the whole core class conception. I think this, along with the self-healing buffs, winds up making Brewmasters substantially easier to heal in Mythic Plus, and it does make me want to bump them up a bit in their final ranking from where I had put them before. So unlike in the raid video where I said that external healing requirements weren't a big issue for monks, in Mythic Plus they absolutely are. You only have one person healing the group, so tanks need to be able to mitigate lots of damage or heal lots of damage, or ideally do both, like Druid. Monks are at the lower end of the spectrum on both of those. Today's buffs helped a lot, but they are still weaker than the rest of the classes on that end. Monks do a great job of turning big hits into medium-sized hits and then staggering that damage over time. In a raid where the big hits are the thing that's scary and you have a squadron of healers who can throw heals at you to cover your health pool while that big stagger is running out, Monk is great. In Mythic Plus, you don't have that luxury, so where a warrior blocks all the auto attacks or a Death Knight just death strikes the pain away, monks dodge half the hits, then gets their bones blasted into dust by the other half. Expel Harm is a good emergency healing tool, but it's not quite enough to compensate for the class's weak mitigation. Again, today's buffs, I think, really help smooth over that quite a lot, but it's fair to say that Monk is still bringing up the rear on the defensive end. Kiting is an option and basically a necessity at times, but it's also very annoying. The biggest upside to Monk is that it deals a ton of damage. Monk's damage was nerfed by about 5 to 10% with the most recent reset, which is unfortunate, but it's still good at the high end of damage among tanks. In terms of group utility, Monk is fairly limited. You have Ring of Peace, Leg Sweep, Paralysis, and Clash. You bring the 5% physical damage debuff, and that's about it. Damage is the ultimate utility, and you bring that, but Monk is actually fairly mediocre when it comes to group utility in Mythic Plus. Okay, rating time. Monk is in last place, but not by a whole lot. I think that puts monks into the B tier, but definitely a step down from Blood DKs. I mean, they're a step down from everyone else defensively. The buffs to their defenses last night help. I think that's what, puts them at least in the same sort of letter grade as Blood DK here. But the nerfs to their damage output don't. The silver lining is that Monk can still deal a lot of damage, and they're fun and relatively easy to do some of the basic aspects of tanking on, like picking up threat at the start of pulls. It's fairly complicated to play at a high level, but using your defensive toolkit, holding threat, that's quite easy compared to DK. So that's why I feel okay putting Monk next to them on the list, but Blood DK is like a B+ here. Monk is like a B minus. I want to be clear, I don't think that Monk is bad. It's a really good tank at the level that the vast majority of players play the game and do Mythic Plus play at, and that's good. Just because it's the worst tank doesn't make it bad. It's not bad. The problem is that monks have a lower defensive floor than all the rest of the tanks, and that makes playing them when you're undergeared, such as at the very beginning of a new expansion, way more difficult. So for the first couple of weeks of the first season of the expansion, staying alive on a monk will be harder than staying alive on a DK or a Demon Hunter or all of the other tanks. The damage output and defensive cooldowns are very strong, and I think that there's a high possibility that Brewmaster outperforms a lot of the early expectations that people have had for them once players, frankly, get better at the class and pick up a lot more gear as the season progresses. I had written this all before the stealth buffs to defenses, but having gone back through it, I think it's even more true now. Brewmaster is like Blood DK. It tends to be more susceptible to getting killed by sustained damage early on in a patch cycle or an expansion when item levels are low. But as they gear up, they scale up faster than other tanks and catch up to them due to the scaling of Death Strike healing in DK's case or Stagger in Monk's case, which basically just works like an extra armor scaler. Monk has a strong base kit, and it's like one buff to expel harm or the base health pool away from just basically being a middle-of-the-pack tank in Mythic Plus. If Blizzard reverts any of the nerfs that they've made to Monk recently, it would be very competitive again, and I think it's going to wind up being fine as the season progresses, but I expect the start of the Mythic Plus season to be pretty tough. Now let's move on to Paladin. Paladins are much stronger in Mythic Plus than they are in raids, despite their Word of Glory healing being pretty mediocre, and that's because they have the other side of that defensive equation that you really need: excellent, consistently high damage mitigation. Word of Glory kind of sucks now, but Pally has a baseline of around 60% block chance in normal raid gear. You also get an extra 10% parry chance if you're using Strength in Adversity, and you have a really good defensive cooldown coverage thanks to Sentinel, Eye of Tyr, and Ardent Defender being available either every pull or every other pull. This gives Pally the ability to seriously reduce their incoming damage. They get a lot of shielding from Bulwark of Order as well, so their defensive kit is very strong. Pallies do deal a lot of damage in AoE as well, thanks to Avenger's Shield and Tyr's Enforcer. Their single target damage was buffed last night at the expense of some Shield of the Righteous damage, but Avenger's Shield was buffed too, so it's actually a defensive boost. They bring great group utility with Blessing of Sacrifice and Bop, and the ability to heal other players with Word of Glory for full value if you want to go that route in your talents. You have Devotion Aura for 3% group damage reduction, which is pretty great, and for some reason Blizzard thought Paladins didn't have enough group utility, so they gave them Battle Res too. You have amazing mob control with Avenger's Shield and Divine Toll, putting caster mobs in prison. You also have Blinding Light and Hammer of Justice, and Fist of Justice reduces the cooldown of Hammer of Justice to under 30 seconds very easily, so your mob crowd control is some of the best around. Alright, it's time to rate Paladin, and I'm pretty happy to say that it is a great tank in Mythic Plus. I think it's right at that A tier, right alongside Demon Hunters. It's not as insane as Druid or another mystery tank that I haven't mentioned yet, but I think it's very comfortably in that A tier, kind of an A plus right next to DH. Really strong in Mythic Plus, but like balanced, not crazy, broken, overpowered. The limited self-healing really is the only thing holding Pally's back from being up in this top echelon of tanks in Mythic Plus. I think that, frankly, if you log in a couple of days and Pallies have gotten their prayers answered and gotten a 40 or 60% Word of Glory healing buff like Monks did with their heals today, Pallies probably do jump ahead of Demon Hunter and maybe up into this top level. Pally probably is my favorite tank to play in pug groups, especially when I'm doing keys that are a little higher than like a weekly 15 once you're kind of into the season a bit, because they have so much mob control and so much positive control over your party's health with abilities like Sacrifice and Lay on Hands and, being able to Word of Glory people when they're low. When you're playing with people you don't know, you can't always count on them to get important kicks or stuns or maybe heal at crucial moments, and Pally doesn't really need someone else to do that for him. You can just carry your group through pretty much any mistakes they make. And then if things do go wrong, you always have some sort of major defensive cooldown to fix the issue. Maybe it's just Eye of Tyr, but maybe it's like Divine Shield with Final Stand. Whatever the problem is, Pally can fix it. Okay, Warriors up last as usual, and I've always thought that having the last name alphabetically has kind of been a problem for Protection Warriors. The class developers get to the bottom of the list of specs, and they're so tired of buffing balanced druids and nerfing everything that isn't a warlock that they just don't have any energy left to even think about Prot Warrior. Finally, being a W class has worked out to Prot Warrior's advantage. W indeed. They buffed the hell out of this class at the start of the alpha, and despite like 5 or 6 attempts to nerf it, it's still preposterously tanky. It takes the least damage of any tank in the game by a pretty huge margin, and it's that enough to make Prot Warrior really good in Mythic Plus? Yeah. But there's more. Warrior has Anger Management and Thunderlord, so your main offensive and defensive cooldowns are all on really short cooldown timers. You have a cooldown available for at least every other pull, but basically just every pull, much like Paladin and Druid. This is really good in high-level Mythic Plus, especially during Fortified weeks, but it's also really good just at the very beginning of the season when you're super under-geared. You also take Unstoppable Force, so Whenever Avatar is up, you're able to thunderclap your way to holding threat very easily. And thanks to anger management, you have Avatar up about 45 to 50% of the time, so the class feels pretty great to play. It's not super complicated either. You don't have a ton of keybinds compared to most other tanks. You're somewhere right in the middle of Druid and Demon Hunter in terms of rotational simplicity, but you have a few pretty good offensive cooldowns to throw in there for some added burst damage too, and that's really great. You also have Ignore Pain just as the extra defensive layer that you can slap on top to keep the whole kit together. Shield Block basically guarantees that you never take an unblocked auto attack, but for everything that gets past your shield, Ignore Pain is there to keep your health bar super safe. For the subject of utility, you provide the Battle Shout buff, which is okay, it's useful for about half the damage dealers in the game, and Rallying Cry, which is pretty great. You also have some good CC tools in the form of Stormbolt, Intimidating Shout, and Shockwave. If you go the Shockwave route, which is a really fun playstyle, having a major burst AoE damage skill up for basically every pull is pretty sweet. Also, Warrior has the unique ability to reflect spells, which usually isn't that useful in raids. Like, anytime it ever winds up being useful in raids, they nerf it into dust. But in Mythic Plus, you can make caster mobs blow their heads off, and that's immensely satisfying. It also makes up for your somewhat crappy damage output. Okay, it's pretty simple. Warrior is an S tier tank, obviously zero question or hesitation on that. I think it's certainly one of the best tanks in the game right now in all situations, and even though Bear Druid does quite a bit more in terms of group value, Warrior is undeniably tankier, so it will be easier to play at the start of the expansion. I don't really think there is a clear-cut best class of the two, or I should say, easier to stay alive on at the beginning of the expansion. Warrior's beefier. Druid deals more damage. Druid has more self-healing. It has more group utility. It has pretty comparable cooldown availability, and it brings hilarious amounts of group healing, assuming that after the wildfire doesn't get like several more nerfs thrown at it. Either way, rage tanks are on top. Both Warrior, and Bear Druid are pretty fantastic tanks. They're relatively quite easy to play, and they're both super tanky. It really is Rage Tank's time to shine. Demon Hunter has such a completely different approach to tanking from every other tank, really, but what it does so incredibly well. Every other tank is built around managing some kind of buff and defensive buff like Shield Block or Iron Fur, Shield of the Righteous, or having major cooldowns available for every pull, or usually both. And Demon Hunter's just out here doing tons of AoE damage, layering tons of defensive and damage reduction effects on top of each other, and having a health bar the size of a raid boss. Pally and Blood DK are both in good shape defensively as well. The main problem that each class has is basically the exact opposite of the other. DK has tons of healing, but its damage mitigation is a little suspect. Pally's healing sucks, but their damage mitigation is fantastic. I think the reason I feel comfortable putting Paladin a letter grade ahead of Blood DK is that it's so much easier to play than Blood DK. Pally picks threat up on pulls by casting Avenger Shield and walking into melee range. Blood DK picks up threat by hitting Death and Decay, Death's Caress, and Dancing Rune Weapon, and Blood Boil, and Tombstone, and Marrow Rend, and Blood Boil again, and it's a lot more complicated at some of the basic aspects of tanking. And for Brewmaster Monk, thanks to today's stealth buffs, I had to rewrite my outro, but I'm completely happy with doing it. I still have concerns with Monk's damage mitigation and self-healing kits, and I think that they are still at the bottom of the pile, but not by a giant, wide canyon like they were before. They have fantastic damage still, and they can do well if you manage your cooldowns effectively, but the level of difficulty for playing a Monk in Mythic Plus and staying alive is fairly high. You will do serious damage though, and it's a fantastic tank in raid, so there's plenty of redeeming qualities to the class. It's not like it's some garbage can. It's gonna be harder at the start of the expansion when your gear is bad, but it will start to catch up to other tanks as you get more gear during the season. Okay, there we go. I did it. 2 tier lists in a couple of days. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.